the human remains of 36 African descendants were found near the Gaillard site in 2013. And now, with the help of the Gullah Society, those remains will find a permanent burial site. I sit down one-on-one with Dr. O of the Gullah Society for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And listen to this interview later on iHeartRadio. Dr. O, it's so good to meet you and see you.
It's good to be seen.
Yes, sir. We were just talking off camera a second ago, but obviously you are a visual anthropologist.
Yes.
And obviously you're a well-renowned professor here at the College of Charleston.
Well, thank you.
And a historian.
Yeah.
What is it like to be you these days?
These days, it's exciting, and it's fulfilling in that, I'm now able to see that those books that, that I started reading, I've always been a reader. And, it makes a lot of sense to have had the start that I had, reading, appreciating literature in the way that I did. I don't even know why I did, but I'm glad that I did. And, as I study and teach my students, others that I have come to know of who started life, some might say at a disadvantaged state. They didn't grow up in a household with a lot of readers and a lot of books, and some didn't have anyone who could read, who had graduated from college or anything like that, but just the inspiration inside of us that I have to say comes from a place where our ancestors are, a thing that they came with, that they passed on to us,
Sure.
That inspired us. And so when I think of great men like Marcus Garvey, who knew the dictionary, who mastered the dictionary and would have people challenge him, pick any word in the dictionary and I'll tell you what it means. It's an amazing mind. Literature. He went on to write newspapers and spread his word around the world. Malcolm X, the same thing.
Sure.
Reading. Once he was in that still space where he could feed his mind through reading and literature. Boom. So to be in the place where I am today, where what I encourage students to do and what many of my students have said that they now do, read. So that's a long answer to your question.
Oh, no, you're good to go, actually. What books are you reading these days?
Oh, man, I read 5 books at a time. I do. I do. So I have on my nightstand, I have 5 books turned upside down. And wow, what books am I reading? Well, for this class semester, we use He Shall Go Out Free, Denmark, BC.
Right.
Then we use the autobiography of Malcolm X, because this particular class is discussing revolutionaries.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And we used Bones of Blood, which is a new book that's been written by a young lady, Ayinde. I can't recall her last name. And we're reading, we read because the semester is over as far as classes for me.
Okay.
Barracoon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, another good book.
Yeah.
A recent book. And Their Eyes Were Watching God. Zora Neale Hurston. But I have an incredible library. When I was in graduate school, I used to have graduate students that used to hang out with me so they can get to my library. I figured that out later on, why they were hanging out with
Right.
me. I'm likable enough.
Yes.
But they was trying to get to my library.
way.
Yeah. A couple of them told me that. We wanted to get to your library.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What would you add to your library now?
There's so much new literature, particularly around Gullah.
Oh, yes.
And so now I'm adding more books to my library written about Gullah.
Oh, yeah.
By Gullah people, which is exciting, And my most recent book was my children give me books. That's what their gifts are to me, but that's what my gifts were to them. Yeah. And so I just got a really nice autobiographical picturist book for John Basquiat.
Oh, yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
Amazing artist. Yeah. That's one of my poems on the wall there. I'm a writer as well. You can hardly be a reader and not be a writer.
Sure.
And in fact, there's a play that's being presented on May 3rd. That Big Mama. Yeah, that's my play. And so I'm all over the place right about now.
All over the place right now. And one of the things that are keeping you busy is basically about your, and you talked about this earlier, your ancestors.
Right.
Obviously, human remains were uncovered at the construction site of the Gaillard Center, and they're expected to be reburied in May.
May 4th.
How would you write that?
It's an amazing story. And while these ancestors in Charleston were, they surfaced, in 2013, that wasn't the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story was in New York City when those ancestors surfaced there. And so there's a New York African burial ground where they discovered 400 people, and they had to reinter them. And, as a result of those people, they now have a New York African Burial Ground memorial. They now have a New York African Burial Ground information center.
Oh, yeah.
Interpretive center.
Right.
And now they're talking about a New York African Burial Ground museum.
Yeah.
So it started there. And because those ancestors that came up out of the ground there caused New York to take another look at their story, the narrative around New York, because Africans were not included in the early narratives around New York. They weren't included as the developers. They weren't included as the early farmers. Right. They weren't included as even free people, because they were free people early in New York, and then enslaved when the English came. So the story, and this was in 1700s, similar time frame as these ancestors here.
Right.
So we know that New York City was a port city.
Yes.
Similarly to Charleston is a port city. Some got dropped off here, some got dropped off there. Same people. Same people wound up in different destinations. Right. So these ancestors have the potential to do the same thing for Charleston, force us to revisit the narrative. And the time in Charleston is forcing us to revisit the narratives.
Okay.
So these ancestors resurfaced to join the conversation and to add their 2 cents. And they've been doing that. So since they were uncovered, initially the city wanted to do what the cities do. They were developing the Gaillard Center. They didn't want to stop the development. Contractors and developers don't do that. They want the work to continue so they can get paid. So the city had a couple of proposals in mind as to how they wanted to reinter the bones. And so because I'm an archaeologist and because I knew and am aware of how Native Americans remains are treated.
Sure.
the dignity that Native Americans demand for the retreatment of their remains and artifacts associated with them. And because I knew of New York City, I was insistent on something similar that we have that here. But Charleston is a hard town, and the hardest part for me was to get the community engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I worked on that and got the documentaries about the New York burial grounds, showed them in the public library, invited people to come and see it. And it kind of went away. The bones were still in the boxes in the storage room. I still had my interest and intent to ensure that those bones be reinterred with some dignity. And then it became campaign time for Mayor Tecklenburg, and I stayed in his ears. Literally stayed in his ears during his campaign. And when he won, I was in his ears again, and he started to listen. And he went to visit some of the burial grounds with me.
Okay.
Took me to his family burial ground, and saw the difference. His family burial ground has monuments that are erected and standing tall.
Okay.
The land is clear. You could visibly appreciate that you're in an ancestral sacred space.
Sure.
Where I took him, tombstones were falling over. Trees were falling down on tombstones. Everything was overgrown. Distinctly different. And, part of it is that, the grave where I took him, the Monrovia Cemetery, not the Monrovia but there's another cemetery on Monrovia Street.
Right.
And people confuse that with Monrovia Cemetery, but they're in very close proximity.
Right.
Yeah. So, we have cemeteries where African and African descended people were buried all over this city. Many of them have buildings built on top of them now, parking lots built on top of them. And, we just think that needs to stop, one. And those that have been identified need to be acknowledged.
How many have been identified right now?
Well, I think that Grant Michaud, who works with Gullah Society, I think he had said that at one point there were 67, some big number, and now it's down to 6 or something.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm not sure about those numbers, but it's pretty astounding.
And I know you told Channel 5, quote, "These bones are the marrow of Charleston. They're the inner part of Charleston."
What does that mean?
You said, quote, "These bones are the marrows of Charleston."
Yeah, I got that. You want to know what I meant by that?
Yeah, talk to me more about it.
Yeah. All right. We African people and their descendants, we took the mud out of the ground to make the brick. We fired the brick. We took that brick, we used that brick to build some of these fabulous homes. We put the mortar in the brick. Once the brick was up, we went inside. We did the plaster work. We did everything. That's the inside. My mother, she would give us the chicken. We'd eat the meat. So we didn't have much. My mother was a single mom raising 8 of us in New York City. Yeah, because I went to New York when I was 7 to join her. And she would take that bone, and she would bite on that bone, eat the marrow. That was the meat for her. that was the joy for her. We got to enjoy the chicken. She got to enjoy the marrow. The enslavers got to enjoy the chicken. We got to enjoy the marrow. We are the marrow. Because you are what you eat, right?
That's true. And I know that researchers have determined that the remains included 11 women, 16 men, and 7 children. 2 of them were infants. Where are you still emotionally?
You know, we always want to assume that any person of that time period were enslaved. That's not necessarily the case.
Okay.
We don't know who those people were. Presently, we don't.
Okay.
You know, research will reveal more about them, you know, but just in terms of how they were buried, they were buried with some dignity. Some of them, they had on clothes with buttons.
Wow.
You know, some of them had their personal stuff with them, beads, and, you know, enslaved people didn't have clothes with buttons on them. They had rags. They didn't, you know, they weren't given the privilege to be buried with things that were special to them. So, you know, I feel that, you know, emotionally that, you know, that these people bring a story that we need to hear. We need to hear who they were, that they were given this kind of dignity in their burial. Who were they?
And, you know, obviously you said this quote, "This is indeed an African burial ground, but our emphasis on this is a burial ground of the ancestors of Charleston, because these ancestors belong to all of us." You also said this quote, "They predate some of the notions that we developed over the many years about each other."
Mm-hmm.
So what were those notions?
That we developed?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. That one group of people was superior and another group of people is inferior. The notion that black folk, the stereotypes that were developed during Jim Crow and the stereotypes that existed before then didn't necessarily exist. You know, black folk were enslaved, but our abilities were not enslaved. Our abilities and our accomplishments, even though we couldn't own our accomplishments, we made accomplishments. We built this place. That's an accomplishment. We couldn't own it. But if we were to tell the story, it would be an accomplishment for us. All right. So the notion that we did nothing, we had nothing, and that this country, this city, but this country more broadly, was not a part of the African experience. That's not true. This country is deeply a part of the African experience because Africans, you know, came brought here and built this country.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously, as you know, they believe the burials took place sometime between 1760 and 1800.
Right.
The Gullah Society has been working with the National Geographic Society to do a grant using DNA evidence to learn more.
Right.
So now that you have some of that evidence, what have you learned more?
Well, we learned that most of the remains are from West Africa. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so recently, and evidence is still coming in because the research is ongoing. Okay. But we discovered that 2 of the skulls were the fragments it's fragmented, but there's enough pieces that we were able to have those pieces scanned, and maybe we'll have a reconstructed face of two people, you know, two ancestors that lived that long ago, you know, further evidence of who we were and what we looked like. Because over time, even that changes.
Right.
Even that changes, you know. So, yes, it's exciting to imagine what this research will lead to. Now, how should I say?
Yeah, are you guys there now?
Something that we hadn't anticipated that the National Geographic grant provided for us was an opportunity to do some educational outreach.
Right.
You know, so we've been reaching out to the local schools, and you know, it's amazing to see the expression on these young kids' faces when they hear what we're doing, and that we're inviting them to participate. So they've been creating artwork, and that will be on display, you know, during the time of the reinterment and ongoing.
Right.
And so they're inspired, our young kids. So when we have these bones of these ancestors that were in the ground since that time, that are now communicating to young people, it's amazing that they're reaching forward and enlightening this generation, who will have this to remember and share with their children. We're marking time. We're marking time. Had those ancestors not resurfaced, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. And so many other things that have developed because they resurfaced. They're going to have some kind of memorial at the Gaillard Center, where they were ignored at the Gaillard Center before this. The Gaillard Center was just buried on top of them. Now they'll have something. They'll be buried free of that, with something to memorialize them on top of them.
And I know that obviously Lachey Oubre said this reburial should make all of us feel as one unit, because the 36 people that were here are all of our ancestors. Whatever they did before they passed was to build this city, was to make Charleston what it is now. If the ancestors were here, what would they think of Charleston now?
Well, my granddaddy is now an ancestor. And I believe ancestral realm is timeless. So if my granddaddy was here now, he would say this is progress. And I would argue with him, because I did. Before he departed, he thought that what was happening was progress. Because perhaps in his time it was, you know, and because he had a lot of stories. He died at 97, but he had a lot of stories, a lot of memory of when he was being paid 50 cents an hour. And at 97, they were giving him checks for $50,000 for his work. Progress. But, you know, progress is not always measured in terms of the material and the tangible. Okay, so while the physical landscape of Charleston looks like progress, what's actually happening to Charleston is it's being deconstructed. The people that I know, and some that you know, are gone. You know, and not necessarily dead gone. Removed gone. It's a different kind of gone.
Sure.
And so it's progress for who? It's progress for Boeing. It's progress for Volvo. It's progress for MUSC. It's progress for, I would dare say, Publix. They got a big building, in a building. Yeah. So it's progress for a lot of people and a lot of entities. But is it progress for those people whose souls are resting in this place? Is it progress for the children and the grandchildren of those people? I'm one of the grandchildren of those people who is remembered as being a famous person here. We have schools named after him, etc. But if you go by his house and see it in its dilapidated state, I invite you to do that.
Okay.
You'll have to ask, how could all of this progress be happening and this important landmark is so neglected? The landmark is the person.
Okay.
You can't celebrate Philip Simmons and not ensure that those things that gave the most meaning to him, his home, is dilapidated. It's because that's evidence that you really don't care about the human being. You care about the story.
The ancestors again.
Yeah, the ancestors.
What would they think about gentrification, affordable housing in Charleston in 2019?
I think the ancestors would say that we've been lied to again. We've been lied to again, and we've never been able to afford housing, but we've always had housing, because what we're not able to afford, we build out of nothing. But we don't even have space to build out of nothing, because there's all the land is occupied, and what's not occupied has been bought and owned. So we don't have a community that we could say is our community anymore. We did, even in its disrepair. It was our community. And we understand why it was in disrepair. Because the resources. I mean, when I read the other day about that $22 million that the local development company owed the City of Charleston, that you don't want to give it back.
Oh yeah, at the Charleston place.
Yes. So that $22 million was earmarked to buy land for the low-income homes to be built on. When the opportunities to buy the land were presented, they didn't have the money, because these people have the $22 million and they were using it to build their world. That's criminal. But the opportunity doesn't exist anymore to buy the land that was available. Somebody else bought that land now, because the money was being ciphered and used by the city. The city and the people in the city authorized these things to happen. The good old boy, we still do that here. We know that. That's That's Charleston. That's the state of South Carolina. That's the South. But things are changing. Things are changing. And to fast forward, I know that because I teach young people. I teach young people. And, I stand in front of them and as witness to their pain, as witness to their confusion, as witness to their desire and intention to make change happen. What they're lacking is leadership. Leadership. So what we're needing to do is to raise up young leaders.
Dr. O, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Well, I appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Quintin.
Anytime.
Yeah.